There is a person this was written for. You probably know them. You might be them. They still believe. That is the thing people miss when they tell this story. They did not walk away. They did not slam the door or write the angry post or make the announcement. They are still here, still showing up, still saying the words. But somewhere along the way, the faith that used to feel like fire started feeling like furniture. Still there, still real, just not something they think about anymore. They have been carrying something they cannot quite name. The gap between what they were told following Jesus would look like and what it actually looks like. The prayers that went up and seemed to stop somewhere short of the ceiling. The cost that kept getting higher while the returns felt harder to see. And now, very quietly, in the part of themselves they do not say out loud, they are wondering, not whether God exists, whether this is worth it, whether the thing they gave up so much to hold on to is actually holding them back from something easier, something safer, something they could touch. That is the person someone sat down and wrote a letter for. We do not know who wrote it. We do not know exactly who received it. Hebrews does not open like a normal, ancient letter. No sender's name. No named audience. No greeting at the front. It begins like a sermon already in motion. Straight into the biggest possible claim about God and his Son. As if the writer had no time for introductions because the people reading it had no time left to waste. Origen, one of the greatest biblical scholars of the early church, read this letter carefully and said something that has never stopped being true. Who wrote it? Only God knows. Scholars still debate the author, audience, and exact setting. What this documentary follows is the internal movement of the book itself. A word of exhortation to people being tempted to drift. 2,000 years later, we still do not know the name on the return address. But we know this. The letter survived, not because someone preserved it carefully in an archive, because every generation has had someone sitting in that room, tired in exactly the way this letter was written for, hearing something in it that would not let them go. That person might be you. So here is the question this letter was written to answer. What are you tempted to return to when Jesus feels unseen? That is it. That is the whole thing. And the answer is longer than you might expect, deeper than you might be ready for, and more personal than any letter without a name has any right to be. Let it begin. Israel was a people who lived inside a story they believed was still happening. Not a story that ended and got written down. A living story. A story that was moving. Every Sabbath was an act of remembering what God had already said and leaning forward into what he had not yet said. Every Passover was not a history lesson, but a declaration we were there, and the God who brought us out is still the God who holds us now. They were shaped by words that were not their own. Words that arrived in fire and cloud and dream and vision. Words that came through men and women who stood up in impossible moments and said, "Thus says the Lord." The prophets were not fortune tellers. They were people who had heard something so real and so urgent that they could not keep it to themselves. And the words they spoke landed in their generation like stones in still water, sending ripples forward through time in ways even they could not fully see. And then, in the canonical prophetic sense, the voice went quiet. From the last of the Hebrew prophets to the world that received this letter, the living prophetic voice seemed to have gone still, not absent, not abandoned, quiet in the way that a room goes quiet when something large is about to happen. The people still had the scriptures, still had the temple, still had the prayers and the feasts, and the whole architecture of a faith built on what God had said. But the fresh word had stopped arriving. And the waiting had been going on long enough that a generation had been born inside it and grown old inside it without hearing what they were waiting for. They were leaning forward into a silence that had lasted longer than anyone expected. And then the letter begins. God, who at many times and in many ways spoke in the past to our fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. Feel the structure of that sentence. Many times, many ways. Prophets. That is the whole history of Israel's relationship with God, compressed into a single phrase. A long conversation, conducted across centuries, through imperfect and remarkable human beings who carried pieces of something larger than themselves. And then his Son. The writer is not saying Jesus is the best prophet, not saying he is the most important voice in a long line of voices. He is saying something about what kind of communication this is. The prophets spoke words that came from God. The Son is not a word that comes from God. The Son is God's own self, making himself known. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 reaches for two images to hold this. The first is the Greek word apogasma, the radiance that streams from a source of light. You cannot separate the light from its source and still have light. The beam coming through your window is not a copy of the sun. It is the sun reaching you. The second word is character, the term for an impression stamped into wax or metal by a seal, carrying the exact form of the thing that made it. The Son is the exact imprint of who God is. This matters more than it is easy to feel when the name has been familiar your whole life. You have spent your life in a world that treats Jesus as a very important religious teacher, a moral example, a spiritual guide, someone whose words are worth following and whose life is worth imitating. And there is nothing wrong with that as far as it goes, except that it does not go nearly far enough for what this letter is claiming. The letter is claiming that when you are dealing with Jesus, you are not dealing with a message about God. You are dealing with God. The whole weight of what that means has not yet landed on most people who have heard the name their whole lives. It is too familiar, too domesticated, too much a part of the vocabulary of a religious culture that has been around so long, it stopped feeling like news. But news is exactly what it is. Think about what it would mean if the person you most need to hear from did not send a letter, did not send a representative, but showed up, in person, in the room, not to deliver information, but to be present. That is the claim Hebrews opens with. God, present, speaking in a person, not a page, the whole weight of what God has been saying across centuries, arriving at last in the form of a life. And then the writer does something that catches most readers off guard. Having made the highest possible claim about who Jesus is, he immediately places that claim next to the angels. Why angels? Because, in the world of the first century, angels were not greeting card decorations. They were terrifying intermediaries of divine power. When angels appeared in the Hebrew scriptures, people fell on their faces. When the law was given at Sinai, Jewish tradition understood angelic beings to be present in the mediation of that event. Angels were the closest thing to God that the created world had ever experienced. If you wanted to talk about spiritual power and divine proximity, angels were the reference point. And Hebrews says Jesus is not in that category, not a more powerful version of what angels are. something else entirely. To every angel God says, serve. To the Son, God says, sit at my right hand. The angels worship him. He does not worship alongside them. This is not a side argument. It is the first move of a letter that is going to spend its entire length making a case that runs in one direction, whatever you are tempted to return to. Whatever seems closer, or more powerful, or more immediate than Jesus right now, it is not. It cannot be, because there is nothing above the category he occupies. That is the first thing Hebrews will not let you miss. Jesus is not another word from God. He is God's own word. Not sent, but spoken in person. Not a message about God. God, making himself known in the only way that is finally and completely true. The angels bow before it. You are being invited to receive it. But here is what the letter does next. And it is one of the most unexpected moves in the New Testament. Having established that the Son is above every angel, higher than every heavenly being, the exact imprint of the nature of God, Hebrews turns around and says he became lower than the angels. For a while, on purpose, in a body, in weakness, in suffering, and that turn is where everything the letter is building toward begins to take shape. Something has shifted in American spiritual life, and it is worth naming honestly before we go further. The number of people who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious has been climbing for decades. But what is less often noticed is the specific direction that spiritual hunger is moving. It is not moving toward abstraction. It is moving toward experience, toward the immediate, toward something that can be felt, something that responds, something that does not require the slow and often uncomfortable work of staying in one place long enough to be changed. The language of the universe sending messages, energy and alignment and presence, signs that cut through the noise. Angels watching over you. These are not the obsessions of people who stopped caring about the sacred. They are the obsessions of people who care intensely about the sacred and have concluded that it should be more immediately accessible than most organized religion has made it feel. And even within the church, among people who would never describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, there is a version of this same hunger, the search for the experience that confirms the reality, the service where something breaks open, the moment of supernatural clarity that makes you feel certain, just for a little while, that you are not alone in this. Hebrews does not mock that hunger. It is a legitimate hunger. Human beings were made for contact with the sacred. And when the sacred feels remote, the desire to find something that actually reaches through is not a weakness. It is a sign that something real is missing. But Hebrews asks a question about that hunger that is harder to sit with. What are you actually looking for? Because if you are looking for power, there is plenty of power above you. The angels are fire, as Hebrews says, quoting the Psalms, ministers of flame, beings of an order entirely different from flesh and blood, carrying the weight of divine purposes across the structure of creation. If impressive power is what you need, the hierarchy above the visible world is full of it. But if what you are looking for is not just power, if what you need is not something that dazzles you from a distance, but something that can actually reach you where you are, something that knows what it is like to be in this body, in this world, carrying this weight, then angels cannot give you that, because angels do not bleed. This is the move Hebrews makes in chapter 2, and it is as strange and important as anything in the New Testament. The one who is higher than the angels became, for a time, lower than them. The language the letter uses is brakuti, a little lower, a little while, not a permanent diminishment, not a contradiction of who he is, a deliberate step down, taken for a reason. And the reason Hebrews gives is not what most people expect. He became lower than the angels so that he could taste death. For everyone, the word for taste is not a word for observation. It is a word for direct experience. He did not watch death from a safe distance. He went all the way into it. The way you taste something when it is fully in your mouth, when you cannot pretend you are somewhere else. Chapter 2 continues with a description that most readers pass over too quickly. Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. Loud cries and tears. That is not the language of someone going through the motions of a human experience while remaining essentially untouched by it. That is the language of someone in genuine anguish. Someone for whom the weight was real. The cost was real. The desire for another way was real. He learned obedience through what he suffered. Sit with that sentence. The one who is the exact imprint of the nature of God learned something through suffering, not because he was ignorant before, because the knowledge that comes through suffering is a different kind of knowledge than the kind that comes through observation. It gets into your body. It lives in your memory. You cannot unlearn it because it is now part of who you are. He has that knowledge about your life, about what it costs to be human in a world that does not cooperate with your best intentions, about what it feels like to be tired in the way that goes down to the soul, about what it is to face something you would rather not face and find there is no way around it. Only through. He knows from the inside. And here is what Hebrews presses with unusual insistence, the one who entered death so fully, who learned obedience through suffering, who prayed with loud cries and tears. That one is the same one who is higher than every angel in the created order. The fire bowed. The one above the angels chose the manger, the road dust, the garden, the cross. You are living in a culture that is searching for spiritual experience because the alternative, a faith that is intellectually held but experientially empty, feels like a slow kind of dying. That search is not wrong, but the direction matters enormously. You can go looking for the fire, for the sign, for the experience that confirms the reality. What is harder to find, and what Hebrews is pointing at, is the one who is both the source of the fire and the one who entered the darkness, so that darkness would not be the last word. The angels are magnificent. They are fire. They serve at the throne of the one who made everything, and they were not the ones who got a human body and walked all the way into death for you. There is an image in chapter 2 that most people pass over too quickly. Hebrews says that Jesus, in his suffering, he is not ashamed to call those who trust him his brothers and sisters. The one who is the exact imprint of the nature of God calls you family. He shared flesh and blood with you, not as a condescension he would prefer to undo, but as the specific and chosen means by which he destroyed the power of the one who holds the power of death. He went into the most human of all human experiences, the one every person in every generation has feared above almost everything else. And he came out the other side as the only one who ever has. He did it, Hebrews says, to set free those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. Fear of death. Think about how much of human life is organized around that fear. How many decisions get made? How many risks not taken? How many things said and left unsaid, because somewhere beneath the surface of daily life, the fact of mortality is running a quiet and constant program that shapes everything. Hebrews says that is a form of slavery, and the one who became lower than the angels did so to break it. The angels are fire, but fire cannot bleed, and it is the bleeding, the specific, costly, embodied suffering of the one who was higher than all of them. That opens something the fire alone never could. The one above the angels chose the manger, chose the road dust, chose the garden and the loud cries and the cross. Not because he had to, because you needed him to. And now the letter turns to someone else. Someone who represents something different from the angels. Something harder to release. Something that goes to the center of who the people in that room believed themselves to be. Moses. There are figures in history who become so woven into the identity of a people that to question their place is not just an intellectual disagreement. It is a threat to something foundational, something that holds the whole story together. For the people who first received this letter, Moses was that figure, not a hero from a distance, not a character in a book they read occasionally. Moses was the architecture of everything. The Exodus, the law, the covenant, the entire framework by which they understood who they were and who God was and what it meant to live in relationship with him. All of it came through Moses. When a Jewish child in the 1st century learned what it meant to belong to this people, Moses was the first answer to almost every question. Who brought us out? Moses. Who gave us the law? Moses. Who stood on the mountain and spoke with God face to face? Moses. No other figure in the Hebrew scriptures carried that weight. Not Abraham, though he was the father of the nation. Not David, though he was the greatest king. The text of Deuteronomy closes with a sentence that had stood unchallenged for over 1,000 years. There has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Face to face. That was the standard. That was the measure of greatness in this tradition. So when this letter says what it says about Moses in chapter 3, it has to be read with full awareness of what it is doing. It is not taking a minor figure and repositioning him. It is touching the central pillar of an entire people's identity with a claim that would have made the room go very quiet. And here is what makes the claim remarkable. The letter does not make it by tearing Moses down. That is what you might expect. That is what a lesser argument would do. Set up the comparison by diminishing one side to make the other look larger. But Hebrews does not do that. It says Moses was faithful. The Greek word is pistos, meaning trustworthy, reliable, someone who can be counted on completely. And the scope of that faithfulness is specified: faithful in all God's house. Not partially faithful. Not faithful when it was convenient. Faithful in everything. Across the whole of his calling. The letter honors Moses at full height before it says another word. And then it makes the distinction. Moses was faithful as a servant in the house. Jesus was faithful as a son over the house. Servant and son. In and over. These are not words about moral quality or personal virtue. Moses was not less virtuous than Jesus in the comparison being made here. The distinction is about position and relationship. A servant, however faithful, however skilled, however devoted, operates within the house that belongs to someone else. A son has a relationship to the house that no servant, however trusted, can have. And then the detail that changes the entire reading of Moses, if you let it land. Moses was faithful as a servant, as a testimony to what would be spoken later. Read that again slowly. Moses was not just doing his job and doing it well. Moses was bearing witness. His entire life and ministry, the Exodus and the wilderness and the law and the tabernacle and every detail of the system he was given to build, was pointing forward to something that had not yet arrived. He was, in the deepest sense, a prophet not just with his words, but with his whole life. The whole thing was a sign pointing past itself. This is not a diminishment of Moses. In a strange way, it is the highest possible reading of him. His faithfulness was so complete that it became a kind of prophecy. What he built was real. What he established was from God. And it was designed, from the beginning, to point beyond itself to the one who is not a servant in the house, but the son over it. Now here is where the letter stops being about Moses and starts being about you. You have guides. You have people and traditions and systems that have pointed you toward God. A pastor whose preaching opened the scriptures in ways that changed how you saw everything. A tradition with centuries of thought and practice behind it. A mentor who spoke into your life at exactly the moment when you needed it. A book that found you at the right time. A community that held you when you did not know how to hold yourself. None of that is wrong. Hebrews is not saying, throw away your guides. Moses was faithful. What he built was real. But there is a question underneath all of it that is worth asking honestly. Are you following the guide? Or are you following the one the guide was pointing toward? Because guides fail, not because they are bad, but because they are human. The pastor you trusted completely turns out to have feet of clay. The tradition you leaned on makes a decision you cannot follow. The mentor moves on, or makes a mistake, or simply cannot be what you needed them to be forever. The community that held you goes through something that makes it feel unsafe. And when that happens, what breaks? If your faith was built on the guide, then the guide's failure becomes your crisis. If your faith was built on the one the guide was pointing toward, then the guide's failure is painful but not fatal. You grieve it, you adjust, but the foundation is still there. Because the foundation was never the servant in the house. It was the son over it. Moses was faithful in all God's house. And every faithful guide you have ever had was doing something like what Moses did, building and teaching and pointing, bearing witness to something larger than themselves. Serving in a house that belongs to someone else. The question is not whether your guides were faithful. Most of them probably were. In the ways that mattered most. The question is whether you have followed their finger all the way to where it was pointing. Because the letter is not finished. And the further it goes, the more clearly it draws the line between everything that points and the one who is pointed to. But before it gets there, it stops. It stops because it has noticed something about the people in the room. Something more dangerous than bad theology or wrong belief. Something quieter and harder to name and far more common than either. They are drifting, not dramatically, not all at once, just drifting. The way things drift when nobody is watching. The way a boat moves when the anchor stops holding. Slowly and without announcement, away from the place they were meant to stay. Nobody decides to drift. That is the thing about it that makes it so hard to see coming and so difficult to name once it has happened. There is no morning where you wake up and say, "Today I am going to start moving away from the thing that matters most to me." There is no conversation, no decision, no line crossed with full awareness that you are crossing it. There is just the current, quiet, patient, constant, doing what currents do. The Greek word the writer uses in chapter 2 is parareo. It means to flow past, to slip away, to let something slide through your fingers, the way water slides when you are not paying attention. He uses it in a warning that sounds almost casual. At first, we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. Lest we drift away from it. Not lest we reject it. Not lest we abandon it in some dramatic moment of crisis. Lest we let it slip. Slowly. The way things slip when you stop holding them tightly enough. You know how it happens. You have either watched it happen to someone you love, or you have felt it beginning in yourself. The prayer life that used to be a conversation becomes a habit, then becomes occasional, then becomes something you feel vaguely guilty about not doing. The Sunday gathering that used to be the anchor of your week becomes something you attend when nothing else comes up. Then something you realize one day you have not done in 2 months. The scripture that used to feel alive starts feeling like an obligation, and then stops feeling like either, and just sits on the shelf, familiar and unread. And through all of it, you still believe. That is what makes it so disorienting when you finally stop and look at what has happened. You did not stop believing. You just stopped attending to the belief. You let the current do what currents do when no one is rowing. Hebrews points to a story that every one of its first readers would have known in their bones, the wilderness generation. These were people who had seen the Red Sea part, who had eaten bread that fell from the sky, who had followed a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night through terrain that should have killed them. Their credentials as people who had witnessed the power of God were not in question. And when they stood at the border of the land that had been promised to them, when the moment arrived to step into everything they had been moving toward for years, they could not do it. It was not a theological crisis. They did not stop believing that God existed or that He had brought them out of Egypt. What broke down was something more specific and more personal. They did not believe that His promise was bigger than their fear. They had seen what He could do, and they still chose to trust what they could see over what He had said. And Hebrews says, "Do not harden your hearts as they did." It is worth sitting with that word, hardening, because it does not happen all at once. A heart does not go from soft to stone in a single moment. It hardens the way calluses form, through repeated contact with something that produces resistance, through choosing the same small faithlessness enough times in a row that the choosing starts to feel like just the way things are. The wilderness generation did not decide one morning to distrust God. They made a series of smaller decisions, each one feeding the next, until by the time the moment of real decision arrived, the pattern was already set. Here is what that looks like in a life today. You are busy, genuinely busy, not looking for excuses, carrying real responsibilities, and the disciplines that used to hold your attention toward God start to feel like luxuries you will get back to when things slow down. But things do not slow down. They speed up, and somewhere in the acceleration, the center shifts. Not dramatically, just by a few degrees, and then a few more. And one day you look up and realize that what you are primarily trusting, what you are actually depending on to hold your life together, is not what you would have said you trusted if someone had asked you a year ago. You are trusting the plan, the career, the relationship, the financial cushion, the platform, the approval of people who matter to you, the version of yourself that is competent and capable and does not need to be held by something invisible. None of those things are necessarily bad, but they are not God, and the drift has moved you from one to the other so gradually that you barely felt it happening. The writer of this letter was a pastor before he was a theologian. And what he does with this warning is what good pastors do with hard things. He does not stop at the diagnosis. He does not leave you with the image of the hardened heart and nowhere to go. He says today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Today, not after you have gotten yourself together, not after you have resolved the questions or cleaned up the spiritual disciplines or figured out why the drift happened in the first place. Today, right now, in whatever condition you are actually in, with whatever distance has opened up between where you are and where you know you should be. The door is not behind you. The invitation is present tense. The wilderness generation stood at the border of everything they had been promised and chose the familiar fear over the unfamiliar faith. They went back into what they knew instead of forward into what they had been given. Hebrews holds that story up not as condemnation, but as a mirror. The question it places in front of you is not whether you have drifted. Most people who are honest with themselves already know the answer to that. The question is what you do today, now that you can see it. And then the letter does something that most people miss because they are still looking at the mirror. It offers something, not a command to do better, not a list of disciplines to restore. Something that the wilderness generation stood at the edge of and walked away from. Something that every exhausted person in every generation has been searching for in one form or another and finding only in pale and temporary versions. Rest. America is exhausted, not in the way that gets fixed by a long weekend, not in the way that a better sleep schedule or a meditation app or a week at the beach can touch. Something deeper than that. A weariness that has settled into the bones of a culture that has been running at full speed for so long it has forgotten what it was running toward. The wellness industry has never been larger. The productivity systems have never been more sophisticated. The frameworks for boundary setting and burnout recovery and intentional living have never been more widely available. And people are still tired, still anxious, still carrying something that all of it cannot quite reach. Because the thing underneath the exhaustion is not a scheduling problem. It is not a discipline problem. It is not even primarily a rest problem in the ordinary sense of the word. It is a trust problem. Hebrews understood this. In chapters 3 and 4, the writer reaches back to the wilderness story and pulls out of it something that is not primarily about geography or ancient history. It is about the deepest structure of human rest and why the version most people spend their lives searching for keeps slipping through their fingers. The word the letter uses is katapausis. It appears multiple times in these 2 chapters, circling the same idea from different angles. It is the rest that God entered after the work of creation was finished. Not the rest of depletion, not collapsing after exhaustion. The rest of completion. The rest that comes when something is truly done. When you can set it down because the work is finished and what you have made is good. That rest, Hebrews says, was always meant to be entered by human beings. It was built into the structure of creation from the beginning. The Sabbath was not a rule added on top of life as a religious obligation. It was a built-in invitation to step into the rhythm of God Himself, to practice the kind of rest that says the world does not depend on you to hold it together. And the wilderness generation stood at the entrance to it and turned away. They had the invitation, they had the evidence, they had everything except the one thing the entrance required, a trust that was willing to stop managing the outcome. Because that is what the promised land represented in the logic of Hebrews. Not just territory, the place where the striving could end, where the wandering was over, where you could plant and build and live without the constant background noise of not yet, not yet, not yet. The wilderness generation could not enter because they could not stop gripping the fear long enough to take the step that rest required. And Hebrews says, do not make the same mistake. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his. Rested from his works. The deepest form of exhaustion most people carry is not the exhaustion of too much activity. It is the exhaustion of too much effort directed at the wrong project. The project of proving. Proving you are enough. Proving you deserve the good things you have. Proving that your faith is real by the quality of your performance. Proving to yourself, to others, to God, if you are honest, that you are not the kind of person who needs to be carried. That project never ends. It cannot end. Because the bar keeps moving. Because there is always more that could be done. Always a gap between where you are and where you think you need to be. Always the quiet suspicion that if people saw all of you, they would not be as impressed as they currently are. Resting from your works does not mean stopping. It means releasing the project of self-justification. It means allowing the work of your life to be held by something other than your own effort to make it mean something. That is the rest Hebrews is pointing toward. Now, the letter has to be heard carefully here, because it is easy to misread what it is offering. This rest is not a feeling. It is not the emotional experience of peace that comes and goes depending on circumstances. It is not something you manufacture by finding the right spiritual practice or finally getting your life organized enough that you can relax. It is a posture of trust, and trust is not the same as certainty. You do not enter this rest by having all the questions answered. You enter it by deciding, in the face of the unanswered questions, to stop treating your own anxiety as the most reliable narrator of what is real. Israel in the wilderness had evidence. Abundant, visible, overwhelming evidence of what God could do. Bread from the sky, water from rock, a sea that opened, fire that led, and still they chose their fear over the promise. Because the promise required them to step forward into something they could not fully control. And their fear was immediate, and the promise was ahead of them. And the gap between those two things was where trust had to live. That gap is where you live too. The circumstances are different. The wilderness looks different in the 21st century, but the structure is the same. There is a promise that is real, and a fear that is also real. And between them is the space where the decision gets made. Not once, but every day. About which one you are going to let shape how you move. Hebrews is not telling you that this is easy. It is not telling you that the anxiety will simply disappear once you decide to trust. This is not a substitute for rest, for care, for help, for the practical things that an exhausted person genuinely needs. But it is naming something that lies beneath all of those things. The rest you are looking for is not on the other side of having everything figured out. It is available right now, in the middle of the unfigured out, to anyone willing to stop treating the outcome as their personal responsibility to guarantee. One more thing needs to be said here, and it is the thing that connects this rest to everything the letter is building toward. The rest is not yours to create. You do not manufacture it. You do not deserve your way into it, or discipline your way into it, or believe your way into it with enough force and consistency that it finally shows up. It is offered. It is already open, already available. The same rest that has been available since the wilderness generation stood at its entrance and chose to walk away. The question the letter keeps pressing is not whether you can find rest. The question is whether you trust the one who is offering it enough to actually stop and receive it. And that question cannot be answered in the abstract. It requires knowing who is offering, which is exactly where the letter goes next. Because the rest is not offered by a system or a practice or a religious tradition. It is offered by a person who, Hebrews is about to argue, is the only one qualified to make the offer. Because he is the only one who has been where you are and knows what the weight actually feels like from the inside. Not from above it, from inside it. There is a question that almost everyone carries and almost no one asks out loud. It lives in the space between the prayer and the silence that follows. It surfaces at 3 in the morning when the things you manage to keep at bay during daylight hours stop being manageable. It is the question underneath the question, the one that gives the other questions their specific kind of weight. Does anyone actually understand what this is like? Not in the general way. Not the way a friend can be sympathetic, or a counselor can be professional, or a pastor can be kind. In the specific way. The way that reaches all the way down to the particular texture of what you are carrying. The thing you have not said out loud, because you are not sure there is a way to say it that would make someone else understand. The fear that what is most true about your interior life would alarm the people who think they know you. Does anyone understand that? The world offers many things in response to that question. And most of them are some version of approximation. Someone who has been through something similar. Someone with enough experience to make reasonable guesses. Someone who cares enough to try. These are not nothing. They are genuinely valuable, but they are not the same as someone who actually knows, from the inside, what the particular weight of human weakness feels like. Hebrews chapter 4. Verse 15 is one of the most carefully constructed sentences in the New Testament. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Read the structure of it. The writer starts with a negative, clearing away a misunderstanding before it can take root. We do not have a high priest who cannot. He is heading off the assumption that distance comes with the office, that the one who stands before God on our behalf is therefore separated from the mess of actual human experience, representing us from a place of such elevation that the representation is necessarily abstract. Not that. The letter says the opposite of that. One who in every respect has been tempted as we are. Every respect. The phrase does not have exceptions built into it. It does not say, in most respects, or in the major categories, or in the ways that matter theologically. Every respect. The full range of what human temptation means. The pull toward what is wrong, and the pull away from what is hard, and the pull toward the easier path and the quieter compromise. All of it was present in his experience. And he did not remove himself from it. He went through it. This is the part that tends to get softened in the retelling, flattened into something more comfortable. The temptation of Jesus becomes a theological category rather than a real experience. Something that happened in a formal sense, without the grinding everyday texture that the word actually implies. But Hebrews will not allow that softening. It says what it says with intention, in every respect, as we are. The writer comes back to this in chapter 5, where he describes Jesus offering up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. Loud cries and tears. That is not the language of someone going through the motions of a human experience while remaining essentially untouched by it. That is the language of someone in genuine anguish. Someone for whom the weight was real. The cost was real, The desire for another way was real. He learned obedience through what he suffered. That sentence should stop every reader cold. The one who is the exact imprint of the nature of God learned something through suffering. Not because he was ignorant before, because the knowledge that comes through suffering is a different kind of knowledge than the knowledge that comes through observation. It gets into your body. It lives in your memory. You cannot unlearn it because it is now part of who you are. He has that knowledge about your life, about what it costs to be human in a world that does not cooperate with your best intentions, about what it is like to be tired in the way that goes down to the soul, about what it feels like when the people who were supposed to understand you do not, about what it is to face something that you would rather not face and find that there is no way around it, only through. He knows from the inside. Now set that next to the image that Hebrews has been building of the temple and the priesthood. In the system of worship that Israel had lived inside for generations, access to God was carefully structured. The tabernacle, and later the temple, was organized as a series of spaces, each one more restricted than the last, moving inward toward the place where the presence of God dwelt, the Holy of Holies. The innermost room, separated from everything else by a thick curtain. Ordinary Israelites could enter the outer courts. Priests could go further. But into the Holy of Holies, only the high priest could go. Once a year, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and not with empty hands, with blood offered first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. The system communicated something true and important about the nature of God. There is a holiness here that human beings cannot simply walk into on their own terms. The curtain was not an arbitrary obstacle. It was a statement about what human beings are and what God is, and the gap between the two that requires something to bridge it. But the system also communicated, as its own limitation, that the access it provided was partial and temporary and dependent on a priest who was himself subject to all the same human limitations as the people he represented. The high priest offered blood and went in and came out, and a year passed, and the whole thing happened again. Because what had been offered was not enough to make the access permanent. Hebrews is about to say what it means that a different kind of priest has now entered the Holy of Holies. But before it gets there, it pauses at this one verse. This remarkable sentence about sympathy and temptation and knowing from the inside, and draws from it the most practical conclusion in the entire letter. Let us, then, with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. The word translated as confidence is parrhesia in Greek, and it carries weight that the English does not fully capture. It was the word used in Athenian democracy for the right of a free citizen to speak openly before the assembly without fear of punishment, to say what was actually true, to bring the real thing, not the managed version, to stand before power and not hide. That is the posture Hebrews invites you to bring to God. The edited version is not what is needed here. The version of yourself that has cleaned up the doubt and resolved the inconsistency and arrived at something presentable, that is not what the throne of grace is waiting for. Bring the actual version, the tired one, the one with the questions still in his hands, the one who has been drifting and knows it, the one who is carrying something she has not been able to put down. That version, bring that one. Because the one who sits at the throne of grace is not waiting for you to have it together. He already knows what you are carrying. He knew it from the inside before you ever brought it. He learned it the hard way, through loud cries and tears, through the full weight of what being human in this world actually costs. The throne of grace is not a throne of performance. It is a throne of grace precisely because grace is what you need and performance is what you have been trying to substitute for it. That is the third thing this letter will not let you miss. Jesus does not open the way to God from a distance. He opens it from the inside. He is not a priest who stands far from what you are carrying. He is the one who carried it first, and carries it still, and meets you in it with something that no system and no tradition and no religious structure, however well designed, has ever been able to manufacture on its own. Mercy and grace to help in time of need, not after the need has passed. In the time of need, right in the middle of it, when the weight is heaviest and the distance feels widest and the question you carry at 3 in the morning is the loudest it has ever been. Right there, but the sympathy of the one who knows from the inside is not all Hebrews has to say about this priest. There is a question that follows naturally from everything just said. If he is this kind of priest, where does he come from? What gives him the right to hold this office permanently, without the limitations that made every priest before him temporary? The answer involves one of the strangest figures in the entire Bible. A man who appears in 2 sentences in Genesis and disappears just as quietly. A man whose very silence in the text turns out to be the most important thing about him. His name is Melchizedek, and most people skip right past him. That would be a mistake. That question from the last chapter is still in the room. If Jesus is this kind of priest, the one who knows weakness from the inside, the one who always lives to make intercession, the one whose sympathy is not abstract but earned through loud cries and tears, what gives him the right to hold that office permanently? Every priest in the system Israel had lived inside for generations held the office temporarily. They aged. They died. They were replaced by their sons, who aged and died and were replaced by their sons. The chain of succession was the only thing that kept the system running. Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. Hebrews acknowledges this directly and does not try to hide it. In the existing priestly system that disqualified him entirely, the priesthood was restricted to the tribe of Levi. No tribal affiliation, no credentials, no access. By the rules that governed the system, he could not be a priest at all. So Hebrews goes looking for a different kind of precedent, and it finds one in the most unexpected corner of the scriptures, 2 sentences in Genesis that most readers have passed over their entire lives without stopping to wonder what they mean. A man named Melchizedek. Let the scene in Genesis land before the argument begins. A battle has just ended. Abraham is returning from a military victory. Having defeated a coalition of kings to rescue his nephew Lot, he is making his way back when 2 figures come out to meet him. The first is the king of Sodom, who will make Abraham a financial offer that Abraham refuses. The second arrives with no introduction and no explanation. His name is Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High. He brings out bread and wine. He blesses Abraham. Abraham gives him 1/10 of everything. And then he is gone. No backstory. No family history. No record of where he came from or where he went. No mention of his birth and no mention of his death. He appears in the middle of a story that is not about him, does what he does, and disappears as quietly as he arrived. The text moves on without explaining him. 1,000 years later, a single line in the Psalms reaches back to that moment. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. The line is addressed to the coming king. the one the Psalms repeatedly anticipate as the fullest expression of everything the Davidic covenant was pointing toward. A priest forever. After the order of Melchizedek, Hebrews picks up that psalm and will not put it down. Here is the move the letter makes. And it is one of the most precise pieces of biblical interpretation in the New Testament. The writer is not trying to prove something supernatural about Melchizedek, the historical person. He is reading the text the way a careful reader reads a text that has left something out, and asking, what does the silence mean? In the world of the Hebrew Scriptures, a person's legitimacy in any role was tied to their lineage. The genealogies that run through Genesis and Chronicles are not filler. They are the architecture of identity. Who your father was determined who you were, what you could do, what you were permitted to hold. The priesthood was built entirely on this principle. Your tribe, your family, your line of descent, these were your credentials. Melchizedek has none of that recorded. No father named, no mother named, no beginning of days written down, no end of life. He exists in the text as a priesthood, with no visible roots and no visible conclusion. And Hebrews says, look at what the silence is telling you. The absence of the genealogy that every other significant figure in Genesis has is not an accident of record-keeping. It is a portrait, written in negative space, of a priesthood whose authority does not come from the system that human beings built. A priesthood that does not begin with a birth and does not end with a death, because its basis is something other than biological descent. Then Hebrews draws the implication. Abraham, the father of the nation, the man from whom all of Israel traces its descent, gave a tenth of everything to this priest. And Levi, the ancestor of the entire priestly tribe, was, in a sense, present in Abraham when that happened, which means the Levitical priesthood, in the logic of this argument, symbolically acknowledged its subordination to the older and stranger order of Melchizedek. The lesser is blessed by the greater. Now hold all of that and read what Hebrews says about Jesus. He has become a priest not through a regulation about physical descent, but through the power of an indestructible life. The Greek word is akatalutos, meaning that which cannot be dissolved, cannot be undone, cannot be made to stop. His priesthood does not end because his life does not end. He holds it permanently. He always lives to make intercession. He always lives. That present tense is not ceremonial language. It is a claim about what is happening right now. Whatever you are carrying into this day, whatever weight has been with you long enough that you have stopped expecting it to lift, the one who is your priest is not off doing something else. He is not limited to certain hours or certain conditions or certain levels of spiritual readiness on your part. He always lives. The intercession never pauses. There is something here that speaks directly into the world most Americans are navigating right now, and it would be dishonest to skip past it. Trust in institutions has been falling for decades. Not just religious institutions, every kind. The systems that were supposed to be reliable have proven fragile. The leaders that seem trustworthy have proven human. The organizations that looked permanent from the inside have cracked under pressures nobody anticipated. And for many people, the church is part of that story, not as an abstraction but as a personal experience. The community that was supposed to be different turned out to be subject to the same failures as every other human institution. The faith that had been housed partly in that institution took damage when the institution took damage. And the question that follows from that damage is not always theological. Sometimes it is just, is there anything that does not eventually fail? Melchizedek shows up in Genesis as a dent in that question. Not an answer to all of it, but a dent. A figure whose priesthood could not be housed in a building that could be burned, could not be dependent on a succession that could be broken, could not be limited to a system that human beings built and human beings could destroy. Because none of those things were where his authority came from in the first place. And Hebrews says that is the order Jesus belongs to. Not the one built on descent and temple and annual ceremony. The one that exists by the power of an indestructible life. Your faith does not ultimately rest on an institution. It rests on a person whose priesthood cannot be dissolved, whose intercession never pauses, whose life cannot be ended by anything in the created order. The silence in Genesis 14 was a sign. It was pointing across 1,000 years at something the text could not yet fully say. And now, in this letter, to exhausted people in a small room somewhere in the first-century world, the sign is being read at last. What Melchizedek pointed toward has arrived, and he always lives. But a priesthood is not complete without a covenant, and the covenant this priest mediates is not the old one. The writer is about to quote the longest passage from the Hebrew Scriptures anywhere in the New Testament, because what Jeremiah saw 600 years before this letter was written is exactly what this priest came to establish. And the most important thing about that covenant is not what it commands. It is where it writes. There is a difference between knowing what is right and being the kind of person who does it. Everyone who has lived past the age of 20 knows this from the inside. You know the thing you should not say, and you say it anyway. You know the pattern that is hurting you, and you repeat it anyway. You know what love requires in a particular moment, and you choose something smaller anyway. The gap between what you know and what you actually do is not a gap in your information. It is a gap in something deeper. Something the information alone cannot close, no matter how much more of it you acquire. This is not a modern problem. It is not a product of the particular pressures of contemporary life or the specific failures of any one generation. It is as old as human beings thinking carefully about themselves, and it sits at the center of what the Hebrew Scriptures most honestly observed about the nation of Israel. They had the law, the most careful and comprehensive ethical and religious framework the ancient world had ever produced. A system that accounted for the treatment of strangers and the care of the poor and the rhythms of work and rest and worship and commerce and justice. Torah was not a simple set of rules. It was an entire vision of what a human community organized around the character of God would look like. The law was good, genuinely good, given by God and meant to be kept. And they could not live it. Not consistently, not across generations. This is not a statement that Torah failed. Hebrews is reading from inside the tradition, not standing outside it to mock it. The argument it is making is more careful than that, and more honest. The problem was not in the law. The problem was in the place the law was written, carved into stone, set in front of human beings. The law could tell them what was required. It could inform, and it could command, and it could judge. What it could not do was change the person deeply enough to want to do it. A stone tablet speaks to the outside of a person. It cannot reach the place where the actual decisions get made, which is not the mind that processes information, but the will, the desire, the deep interior of a person that either moves toward what is good or does not. And that movement is not primarily a matter of knowing more. 600 years before this letter was written, a prophet named Jeremiah, sat in the middle of the worst national catastrophe his people had ever experienced and wrote something that should not have been possible to write in that moment. Jerusalem was falling. The Babylonian army was outside the walls. Everything that had defined the nation, the temple, the monarchy, the land, the whole architecture of what it meant to be the people of God in that particular form, was about to be taken away. It was not a moment that invited optimism about the human future. And Jeremiah wrote this: "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, not on stone carried outside them as a standard to be measured against. Inside them, in the place where desire lives, where the will forms, where the actual person makes the actual choices that make up an actual life." Hebrews quotes this passage in its entirety. It is the longest quotation of the Hebrew scriptures in the entire New Testament, which is itself a statement about how central this promise is to the argument. The writer is not using it as a proof text. He is saying this is what everything has been building toward. This is the promise that the Old Covenant, for all its genuine goodness, was pointing toward, but could not itself be. The problem was not that God had not spoken clearly. The problem was that human hearts had not been changed deeply enough to live what had been clearly spoken. This is Hebrews reading Israel's own scriptures from the inside, following a thread that Jeremiah himself laid down in the middle of a national catastrophe. The New Covenant is not an outside critique of Torah. It is the fulfillment of what Torah was always gesturing toward, not just a people who knew the right thing, but a people formed deeply enough to actually become it. Then the letter makes a move that is logically clean and theologically serious. If God announced through Jeremiah that a new covenant was coming, one that would be fundamentally different from the old one, then the old covenant was, by God's own announcement, not the final word. It was preparatory, real and given by God and meant to be kept, and it was pointing, from within itself, toward something it could not itself be. Now here is where this has to come down from the level of ancient history and land in the room where you are actually sitting. You have a version of this problem, not with the Mosaic law specifically, most likely, but with the same underlying structure. You know what your life should look like. You have, in some form, a picture of the person you want to be, more patient with the people you love, more honest in the spaces where honesty costs something, more generous in the ways that require you to actually give something up, less controlled by the fears that run quietly beneath the surface of your daily decisions. You know these things. You may have known them for years, and the knowing has not been enough to produce the doing, not consistently, not in the moments when it matters most. What you need is not more information about what is right. You need something to happen in the place where the information does not reach. In the interior where the desire forms and the will either moves or does not. In the part of you that knows the right thing and still chooses the smaller thing. Not because you are unusually weak, but because you are human. And being human means the gap between knowing and becoming is not closed by accumulating more knowledge about what you should be. That is what the New Covenant promises. The law of God placed within, written on the heart, in the place where stone could not reach. This is not a description of moral self-improvement. It is a description of transformation that comes from outside you and moves inward. It does not demand you improve yourself before receiving it. It works the improvement from the inside out. The difference between being handed a standard to achieve and having the standard written into who you are becoming. Jeremiah wrote that promise, sitting in the ruins of everything the old covenant had built. He could see the temple from where he sat, and it was burning. And he wrote about a covenant that would survive the burning, because it would not be housed in a building or a law code or a national structure that could be dismantled by an army. It would be written in the one place no army can reach, the human heart. And Hebrews says, the one who mediates that covenant has come. The one whose priesthood is permanent and whose life is indestructible has also inaugurated the covenant that Jeremiah saw from a distance and wrote down in the ruins of a city that was falling apart. But covenants are not established by beautiful promises alone. They are sealed. And Hebrews is about to say what this one cost, and why the sealing of it means something that no annual ceremony, however sacred, however sincere, could ever mean. Because the most important thing about what happened on the cross is not just that it was costly, it is that it only had to happen once. Picture the Day of Atonement, not as a theological concept, as a scene, as something happening in real time, in a real place, with real people watching and real weight pressing down on everyone present. It is Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, the one day when the accumulated weight of everything the nation has done wrong, every broken covenant and every ignored command, and every moment when the gap between who they were supposed to be and who they actually were had quietly widened. All of it was brought into a single ceremony and addressed. The high priest has been preparing for days. He has bathed. He has put on the white linen garments. He has offered sacrifices for himself first, because he is not exempt from the problem he is there to address. He carries the blood of a bull and the blood of a goat through the outer courts, past the altar, through the holy place with its lampstand and its table and its altar of incense, and then through the curtain, into the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God dwells between the cherubim, where no human being is permitted to stand except this one man. On this one day, with this blood in his hands, he sprinkles the blood, he makes the atonement, he comes back out, and the people exhale. For another year, the account has been addressed. For another year, the weight has been lifted, and the gap has been crossed, and the relationship has been, in some formal and real sense, restored. And then 12 months pass, and the whole thing happens again. This is not a criticism of the system. Hebrews is not looking at Yom Kippur with contempt. The writer understands what it was and what it meant and why it mattered. He understands the seriousness of the people who maintained it and the genuine faith that those who observed it brought to it. He is reading it because the most important thing about the Day of Atonement, in the logic of Hebrews, is not what it accomplished. It is what its repetition revealed. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1. The law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities. It can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? Since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. Read that argument slowly. It is precise, and it is devastating, and it is kind. If the Day of Atonement had accomplished what it was meant to accomplish in a final and complete sense, it would have stopped. The very fact that it continued, year after year after year, was a built-in testimony to its own incompleteness. The repetition was not evidence of the system's strength. It was evidence of the wound still being open. A bandage that needs to be changed every day is not a cure. It is a sign that the healing has not yet happened at the level where healing actually needs to happen. The sacrificial system was not meaningless. It was not false. It was not something God gave to Israel and then later decided had been a mistake. In Hebrews, the shadow is real. Shadows are real. They have shape. They correspond to something. But the shadow is not the substance. And the person who has been living by the shadow their whole life will recognize the difference the moment the substance arrives. The shadow said, "Something is being addressed here." The substance says, "It is finished." And then, in chapter 9, the letter describes what it means that a different kind of priest has entered a different kind of holy place with a different kind of offering. When Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption, once for all. The Greek is epharpax, once, placed upon all of time, covering all of it, reaching backward and forward from the moment of its offering in a way that no annual ceremony could do. Once, because what was offered was sufficient. Once, because the wound that the annual ceremony kept addressing has been addressed at the level where the wound actually was. Not the external level. Not the level of behavior that can be managed and monitored and measured. The level of conscience. Hebrews chapter 9. Verse 14. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? The conscience, the interior voice that knows the truth about you even when no one else does. The part of you that cannot be fully quieted by achievement or approval or the careful management of what other people see. The part that is awake at 3 a.m. when the performance is over and the audience has gone home. That is what the once-for-all offering reaches. There is something in chapter 9 that is easy to pass over and should not be passed over. Hebrews says that Christ entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. The earthly temple was a copy. The earthly priesthood was a copy. The earthly sacrifice was a copy. Not a fraud, not a deception, but a copy, a representation, a shadow cast by a reality that existed at a level deeper than the visible world. What was happening in Jerusalem on every Day of Atonement was a real enactment of something true. But it was true the way a map is true. The map points at the territory. The map is not the territory. The territory is the presence of God. The territory is the actual relationship between human beings and the one who made them. The territory is the conscience truly cleared, not temporarily managed. The territory is access that does not require blood to be brought again next year, because the blood that was brought was sufficient, and its sufficiency does not expire. Now here is what all of this means for the person carrying the weight that many people carry, and almost no one names directly. You have a version of the repetition. Not Yom Kippur, but the same structure in a different form. The cycle of feeling the weight of what you have done or failed to do, bringing it to God, feeling the relief of the transaction, and then watching the weight accumulate again, asking for forgiveness for the same thing you asked for forgiveness for last month, I'm not sure if the asking is doing anything real, or if you are simply going through a form that provides temporary relief without actually reaching the place where the problem lives. The repetition itself starts to feel like evidence. Evidence that it is not working. Evidence that whatever is being offered is not quite reaching the level where you actually need it to reach. Evidence that the wound is still open. You keep changing the bandage, and every time you change it, some part of you wonders if the wound is ever going to close. Hebrews is not saying your asking is pointless. It is saying your asking does not have to be what keeps the account current. The account is not being kept current by your asking. The account was settled once, at the level of the conscience, at the level of the interior self that knows the truth about you, even when you have managed to forget it for a while. The high priest went in and came out every year, and the people exhaled and gathered themselves for another year. Jesus went in once, and the once is the point, not the last in a series, the one that finishes what all the others were reaching for. The repetition said the wound was still open. The once for all says the work is complete, not postponed, not managed, finished. And what is finished does not need to be earned again by the quality of your next prayer, or the consistency of your next spiritual season, or the degree to which you have finally gotten yourself together enough to feel like forgiveness applies. It already applies. The sufficiency does not expire. Now the letter is about to make the most practical move it has made yet. Because if the wound is actually closed, if the access is actually open, if the once for all actually means what it says, then the question that follows is not theological. It is personal. What do you do with an open door? At the moment Jesus died, according to 3 of the 4 gospel accounts, the curtain of the temple was torn in 2, from top to bottom. That detail is in the text. And it is not there by accident. A curtain that tears from the bottom up is torn by human hands. A curtain that tears from the top down is torn by something else entirely. Whatever was happening in the visible world at that moment, what the gospel writers want you to understand is this: the opening was initiated from the other side. The barrier between human beings and the presence of God was not dismantled by human effort, by human progress, by human religiosity, finally reaching the level where access could be granted. It was opened from within. Hebrews does not quote the gospel accounts. It has been building toward the same reality from its own direction. And in chapter 10, having laid out the entire argument about priests and covenants and sacrifices and what it means that the once for all has been accomplished, it arrives at what all of that was for. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, let us draw near. Let us draw near. After 9 chapters of the most sustained theological argument in the New Testament, this is where it lands. Not in a doctrine to be held, or a position to be defended, or a system to be maintained. In a movement, a direction, a step, draw near. The confidence the letter invites here is parousia again. Free speech. The right of a free person to say what is actually true without fear. You are not approaching a throne room where you need to manage your presentation, where you need to arrive with the right credentials, or the right emotional state, or the right level of spiritual preparation. You are approaching a throne of grace, and the grace is not contingent on your performance. The way is not open because you finally earned it. The way is open because it was torn open from the other side. Bring what you actually have. The doubt and the tiredness, and the inconsistency, and the 3 in the morning questions, and the gap between who you present yourself as and who you know yourself to be. Bring it. The one who opened the way from the other side already knows about it. He learned it from the inside, through loud cries and tears, through the full weight of what being human in this world actually costs. Draw near. But here is where most readings of Hebrews 10 stop. And stopping there misses something the letter considers essential. The invitation to draw near is immediately followed by 2 more movements. And they are not individual movements. They are communal ones. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. Draw near, hold fast, consider one another. 3 movements, and all 3 are in the plural. We, us, one another. The door that was opened from the other side was not opened for a private spiritual experience. It was opened for a people, and the people are supposed to walk through it together. This matters more than it might seem at first, because the American version of faith has a persistent tendency toward the individual. Your personal relationship with God, your private devotional life, your interior spiritual journey. These are real things, and they are important. But Hebrews is not primarily interested in your private spiritual experience. It is interested in whether you are walking toward God, and its insistence is that you do not do that alone. Consider one another to stir up love and good works. The word for consider here is katanoeo, a word that means to observe attentively, to fix your attention on something and think carefully about it. It is the same word used in chapter 3 when Hebrews says, consider Jesus. The same quality of attention that you are meant to bring to Jesus, you are also meant to bring to the people around you who are walking the same road. This is not casual. It is intentional. It requires actually knowing the people you are walking with well enough to notice what they need and respond to it. And then the line that lands hardest for the present moment, not neglecting to meet together. As is the habit of some. As is the habit of some. That phrase tells you something about the community this letter was written to. People were already drifting away from the gathering, already deciding that they could manage their faith privately without the inconvenience and the friction and the occasional disappointment of actual community, already concluding that the gathering was optional, that what happened there could be approximated by other means. The writer does not condemn this. He names it as a habit some have developed. And he says, do not do that. Not because the gathering is a religious obligation to be fulfilled, but because the gathering is part of how you hold fast. It is part of how you do not drift. It is part of how the encouragement flows that you cannot generate for yourself. The sight of other people still running that makes you believe you can keep running. The word, spoken at the right moment by someone who knew enough about where you were to know what you needed to hear. Drift almost always happens in isolation. Not the isolation of physical solitude, but the isolation of not being known, of having moved away, gradually, from the people who knew you well enough to notice when the drift was beginning. There are a lot of people right now who have excellent theological content available to them at any hour, podcasts and books and online communities, and more access to teaching than any generation in the history of the church, and who are, for all of that, profoundly alone in their faith, who do not have anyone who knows them well enough to notice the drift, who are holding their faith together with their own hands in a way that is exhausting. because you were never meant to hold it alone. Hebrews is not calling you back to a perfect community. It has never existed. Every gathering of human beings contains human beings. And human beings are the kind of creatures that disappoint each other and misunderstand each other and fail each other in ways both large and small. The gathering Hebrews is calling you toward is not a gathering of people who have it all figured out. It is a gathering of people who are all trying to hold fast to the same thing, and who are, by being present to each other, making it more possible for everyone in the room to keep holding. Draw near to God through the way that has been opened, and draw near to each other, because the way was not opened for you to walk it alone. The door is open, and there are people on the other side of it who need you to walk through it too. But walking through an open door requires something. It requires moving towards something you cannot yet fully see. It requires trusting that what is ahead of you is real, even when everything about your current situation is arguing for staying where you are. It requires what the letter is about to call faith. And the word, as Hebrews uses it, is considerably more specific, considerably more demanding, and considerably more honest about what it actually costs to keep moving toward a promise you cannot yet hold in your hands than the way most people have been using it their whole lives. The next chapter is going to give you names, and some of them are names of people who never saw the thing they spent their whole lives walking toward. That part of the story is in there too. It has to be, because the letter is not interested in easy versions of anything. Hebrews 11 begins with a definition, not a story, not an exhortation, a definition, as if the writer looked at everything that had been said in the previous 10 chapters and decided that before he could go any further, a word needed to be pinned down. Because the word had been floating in the air of this letter since the first page, and people had been using it their whole lives, and the version most of them were working with was not quite right. The word is faith. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The Greek word translated as assurance is hypostasis. It carries a range of meaning, from underlying reality to objective guarantee to the confidence that comes from standing on something solid. What it does not mean is optimism. What it does not mean is choosing to believe something because you want it to be true, or because you were raised in a tradition that holds it, and you have not yet found a reason strong enough to leave. Faith, in this definition, is the actual substance of what is hoped for, present in the life of the person who holds it, before the things themselves have arrived in visible form. And the second word, conviction, renders the Greek elenchos, a term from legal argumentation, meaning evidence that makes a case. Conviction of things not seen means faith functions as evidence, the kind that can be brought into a proceeding and used to establish what is true. This is a very different picture of faith than the one most people are working with. The popular version goes something like this: you do not have enough evidence to be certain, but you choose to believe anyway, because you want it to be true, or because it makes you feel better, or because you were raised in a tradition that holds it. Faith, in this version, is belief in spite of inadequate evidence, a kind of optimistic leap across a gap that reason cannot bridge. Hebrews would not recognize that definition. What it calls faith is not a leap across a gap. It is the actual perception of a reality that the physical senses cannot access. Not less than knowledge. A different kind of knowing. The kind that grasps what is real before the rest of experience catches up. And then, having given the definition, The letter does something that no abstract theological argument can do. It populates the definition with names. By faith, Abel. By faith, Noah. By faith, Abraham. By faith, Sarah. By faith, Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Rahab and Gideon and Barak and Samson and David and Samuel and the prophets. Name after name after name, each one introduced with the same two words, by faith, as if the writer is building something, laying one stone on top of another until the structure is tall enough to be seen from a distance. But before we move through the names, the definition needs one more layer, because the writer adds it in verse 13, and it changes the tone of everything that comes after. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. There it is, the detail that turns this from a triumph list into something far more honest and far more useful to anyone who is actually living in the middle of their story rather than reading it from the end. They died without receiving. The promise was real. Their faith was real. And the thing they were moving toward was still ahead of them when they ran out of time. They saw it from a distance and greeted it. The word for greeted is the word you use when you wave to someone across a field. When you can see them clearly enough to recognize them, but they are too far away to touch. The promise was visible to them, real enough to organize their lives around, and not in their hands when they died. Hold that. Do not move past it too quickly. Because the Hall of Faith, read honestly, is not primarily a collection of people who received what they were promised. It is a collection of people who kept moving toward what they were promised, even when the receiving was a long time coming or did not come at all in the form they expected. Abel worshipped and was killed by his brother. The faith that was honored by God did not protect him from the first act of violence in human history. Noah built the ark before anyone had seen rain. He spent years doing something that looked, to everyone watching, like the behavior of a man who had lost his mind. And when the flood came and the ark floated and the world he had known was gone, what waited on the other side of the water was not the world he had built. It was a world beginning again. With all the fragility and uncertainty of any beginning, Abraham left. Hebrews says it plainly, he went out, not knowing where he was going. The destination was not provided. He had a direction and a voice and a promise that the land he was walking toward existed and would be given to him. He arrived in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents. And he died there still living in tents, having never owned the land that had been promised to him. He was still waiting. Sarah received the promise of a child when she was well past the age of childbearing. She laughed at it. The text does not hide that. She laughed because it was absurd. And then she received it anyway. And then she died. And the nation that was supposed to come from her was still, at the time of her death, 2 people and a handful of grandchildren in a tent. Moses chose suffering with the people of God over the treasures of Egypt. And Hebrews says something striking about why he was looking to the reward. Not the reward of earthly comfort or political power or the kind of vindication that arrives in your lifetime. Something further out. Something he could see the way you see a city on the horizon. Real and specific and present to his perception, even though he was still far from it. He looked at the treasure of Egypt, and he looked at the thing further out. And the calculation said, the thing further out is worth more. He never entered the promised land either. He stood on the mountain and saw it and died there. And then, at the end of the chapter, the writer names people without naming them. He describes experiences without attributing them to specific individuals. Because the experiences he is describing are not the kind that get recorded in the official story. They are the kind that happen to people whose names do not survive. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Some suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, wandering in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And the writer says this about them of whom the world was not worthy. These are not people in the hall of faith because they received something. They are there because of what they held on to while receiving nothing. Their faith was not vindicated in their lifetimes in any way the world would recognize. They wandered. They suffered. They died without seeing. And the letter calls them people of whom the world was not worthy. Now here is where this has to come down from the level of ancient history and land in the room where you are actually sitting. You may have prayed for something and not received it. Something that mattered deeply. Something you brought to God with everything you had. And the answer was not what you asked for, or the answer has not come at all. You may be in the middle of something right now that is not resolving the way faith is supposed to make things resolve, according to the version of faith you were handed. Something that has been going on long enough that you have stopped telling people about it because you can see in their faces that they do not know what to say anymore, and you have run out of ways to explain that you still believe, even though the thing has not changed. Hebrews 11 does not explain why some people receive and some people do not. It does not offer a theological framework that makes the difference make sense. It sits with the full weight of the unanswered and says, these people were also in the hall. The ones who were sawn in two are listed alongside the ones who shut the mouths of lions. The ones who wandered in caves are listed alongside the ones who escaped the edge of the sword. No hierarchy, no explanation, just both, side by side, introduced with the same two words, by faith. What stays the same between the person who receives and the person who does not is the direction of the looking. They all died looking the same direction, toward what they had been promised, greeting it from a distance, acknowledging that they were strangers and exiles on the earth who were looking for a homeland, a city whose designer and builder is God. That is what Hebrews calls faith. Not the certainty that you will receive what you are waiting for in this life. The direction you keep facing while you wait. The choice, made again every day in the face of everything that argues against it. To keep moving toward the promise rather than away from it. The hall is full of people who made that choice and did not always see the results in their lifetimes. And the letter calls them the great cloud of witnesses. The ones who now surround everyone who is still running. Not an audience watching your performance. Witnesses in the legal sense, people who have something to testify to. People who can say, under oath, that the road is real, that it goes somewhere, that what you are moving toward is not a hope that dissolves on contact with difficulty, but a reality that was already there before you started moving and will still be there when you arrive. They saw it from a distance and they kept moving toward it. And when they died, they had not received it and they did not stop. Now, the letter says, it is your turn. The letter has been building this image since the first chapter, and now it arrives. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. The therefore matters. It is doing real work. Everything in chapter 11. Every name and every story and every person who died without receiving what they were promised but kept moving toward it anyway. All of that is the ground on which this instruction stands. Because of them, because of their testimony, because the cloud of witnesses is real and their witness is evidence that the road goes somewhere. Therefore run. But before the running, the laying aside, every weight. The word for weight is ogos, which means bulk or mass, something that does not need to be wrong in itself to slow you down. It is not just the obvious things, the ones you already know you should let go of. It is anything, even good things, that you are carrying in a way that makes the running harder than it needs to be. And then the sin that clings so closely, the kind that wraps around you and trips you up precisely because it is familiar, because it fits so well, because you have been wearing it so long you have stopped noticing the weight of it. The letter does not specify what that is for you. It leaves the specificity to you, because the thing that clings most closely is different for every runner, and only you know what it is. The thing you keep coming back to, the pattern so woven into your daily life that you have almost stopped seeing it as a choice. The thing you would name, if you were honest in a quiet moment, as the thing that keeps tripping you up on this particular road. Lay it aside, not carry it more carefully. Lay it aside, and then run, with endurance. The Greek is hupomone, a word that combines the idea of remaining beneath something rather than running from it or collapsing under it. The posture of someone who is being pressed and who does not move out from under the pressing, who absorbs the difficulty and keeps moving anyway. This is not a word about enthusiasm. It is not a word about the emotional experience of running well. It is a word about what happens when the enthusiasm is gone and the road is longer than you expected, and the witnesses you can see are not the ones ahead of you, but the ones around you who have sat down and are wondering why you are still going. Hupomone, remaining under endurance in the form that only makes sense when things are hard. And then the turn that changes the entire picture of what this endurance is and where it comes from. Looking to Jesus. The word for looking is aphorao. It means to look away from everything else toward one particular thing. Away from the road. Away from the pace. Away from the other runners. Away from the finish line, which you cannot see from where you are standing. Toward him. Why him? The letter gives the reason immediately. Who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. For the joy that was set before him. He endured because he could see something on the other side of the endurance. Not because the cross was not what it was. Not because the shame was not what it was. He despised the shame, meaning he treated it as beneath the dignity of what he was moving toward. Not because the shame was not real, but because what was on the other side of it was more real. He ran looking at the joy ahead rather than at the cost beneath. And the looking at the joy is what made the endurance of the cost possible. This is the most important thing Hebrews says about endurance. And it is the thing that most approaches to endurance miss. The usual approach goes something like this. Focus on the goal. Grit your teeth. Remind yourself why you started. Draw on your reserves of willpower and determination and push through to the other side. This works. Up to a point, human beings are capable of remarkable things through sheer will. But will has limits. And when you have been running long enough, when the road has been harder than you anticipated, for longer than you thought you could sustain, the reserves run low. The determination that felt solid starts to feel thin. And you discover that what you have been trying to sustain on willpower alone was never meant to be sustained that way. Hebrews says the endurance of Jesus was not produced by willpower alone. It was produced by sight. He could see the joy. It was set before him, present to his perception, real enough to organize his movement around, even while the cost was at its highest. And what the letter is inviting you into is not a more disciplined version of the same willpower approach you have already tried. It is a different kind of seeing, looking to Jesus, looking at the one who already ran this road and finished it and is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God, which means the finishing is not theoretical. It happened. He made it. The road goes somewhere. The endurance was worth it. He is the proof, seated at the throne, that the joy on the other side was not an illusion. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. The word for faint-hearted is ekluo, meaning to be loosened, to have something give way. Growing faint-hearted is not a dramatic collapse. It is the slow loosening of what was holding you upright, the giving way of what was keeping you going. The moment when the thing that had been taut enough to bear weight goes slack. The prevention is not trying harder. The prevention is looking at him. Now there is a section of chapter 12 that needs to be heard carefully, because it has been used poorly and has done damage in that poor use. The section about discipline, about God treating you as sons and daughters, about the Lord disciplining those he loves. Hebrews is not saying that every difficulty in your life is a direct punishment from God for something you have done wrong. It is not offering a one-to-one correspondence between suffering and sin, as if every hard thing is a message from heaven about a specific failure. That reading has hurt people, and it is not what the argument is making. What it is saying is that suffering, in the hands of a good Father, is not wasted. That the difficulty you are in right now, whatever it is and however it arrived, is not beyond the reach of a God who knows how to take what was meant to destroy and use it instead to form. That the pressing you are experiencing is not evidence of abandonment. It can be evidence of the opposite. Can be, not automatically is. Not in a way that explains every specific suffering or resolves every specific question about why this particular thing is happening to this particular person at this particular time. The letter is not answering those questions. It is offering something different, the assurance that the one you are running toward is not indifferent to what you are going through in the running. He is present in it. His purposes are not thwarted by it. The road that runs through difficulty is still the road that runs toward him. Consider him who endured. Not consider your suffering and find the lesson in it. Consider him. The direction of the looking is the thing. Fix your eyes on the one who has already run this road and finished it and is now seated and is not absent from where you are. He endured. He made it. He is the proof that the road goes somewhere. That is where your endurance comes from. Not from looking at the road, from looking at him. America is good at running. It is a culture that understands hustle and grinding and not giving up on what matters. There is something right in that. There is something worth keeping. But there is a difference. And the difference is enormous. between running with your eyes on the road and running with your eyes on the one who already ran it and knows exactly where it leads. He knows. He made it. He is seated. And the road leads somewhere that this letter is about to describe in a way that nothing else quite matches. It leads toward a kingdom. And the kingdom has one quality that none of the kingdoms this world has ever offered has had. It cannot be shaken. There is a sentence in Hebrews 12 that most people have heard quoted on a coffee mug, or stitched on a pillow, or printed at the bottom of an email signature. And because they have heard it in those contexts, it has lost the edge it was meant to have. The sentence is this: we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Heard in isolation, as a piece of encouragement. It sounds like comfort, and it is comfort. But it is comfort with a weight behind it that the coffee mug version tends to leave out. Because the sentence does not stand alone. It stands at the end of an argument about shaking. And the argument about shaking is not gentle. Go back to where Hebrews 12 places us before it arrives at the unshakable kingdom. The writer draws a contrast between two mountains. The first is Sinai, where the law was given. He describes it in terms that are not easy to read calmly. A blazing fire, darkness and gloom, and a tempest. The sound of a trumpet, a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. Because what they were hearing was more than they could bear. Even Moses said, "I tremble with fear." This is not a soft picture of the giving of the law. It is a picture of what it means for finite human beings to stand in proximity to the holiness of God without a sufficient mediator. The mountain itself could not be touched without death. The experience of being near God without the right kind of bridge between you was not inspiring. It was terrifying. And then the second mountain. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to innumerable angels in festal gathering, to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. The contrast is not between an angry God and a gentle God. It is between two kinds of access. The access that required the mountain to be cordoned off and the voice to be unbearable, and the access that has been opened by the mediator whose blood speaks a better word, the same holiness, a different bridge. And then, out of this contrast between the two mountains, the letter makes a move that is both a warning and a promise, and one of the most clarifying things ever written about what human beings are actually looking for when they look for security. His voice then shook the earth. But now he has promised, "Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens." The quote is from the prophet Haggai. The shaking at Sinai was local and temporal. A physical mountain trembling under the weight of divine presence. What is coming is larger, not just the earth, the heavens, everything. And then the interpretive key that tells you how to read the shaking rather than simply being destroyed by the thought of it. This phrase, "Yet, once more," indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. The shaking is not random. It is not chaos. It is a kind of sorting. Everything that can be shaken will be shaken, and the shaking will remove it. Not because God is destroying for the sake of destruction, but because what is temporary was never meant to be treated as permanent. And the shaking is what finally and definitively separates the two categories that human beings spend most of their lives confusing: the temporary and the eternal. Now bring that down from the cosmic level to the personal one, because the cosmic level is only useful insofar as it illuminates the personal one. You have watched things be shaken, maybe in your own life, maybe in the lives of people you love, maybe in the larger world in ways that could not be ignored even if you wanted to ignore them. The institutions that were supposed to be permanent, the relationships that were supposed to last, the financial structures that were supposed to be reliable, the bodies that were supposed to stay healthy, the careers that were supposed to hold, the communities that were supposed to be safe. Some of these things were shaken by catastrophe. Some were shaken by slow erosion. Some were shaken by the simple fact that human beings age and change, and that nothing built by human hands carries within itself the principle of its own permanence. And when the shaking happened, if you are honest, you discovered something about what you had been building your life on. Not what you said you were building it on, what you were actually building it on, in the way that only gets revealed when the foundation is tested. Because the things that shook you most were not the things you knew were temporary. The things that shook you most were the things you had been treating as if they could not be shaken. The income, the relationship, the health, the reputation, the community, the version of yourself that was competent and capable and did not need to be held by anything invisible. When those things shook, they took more with them than they should have if your foundation had been what you thought it was. They took your sense of ground, your sense of being held, your sense that there was something beneath you that would not give way. And Hebrews is saying that experience, as painful as it was telling you something true. Not that God abandoned you, that you had been building on things that were made to shake. Not because they were bad, but because they were created, and created things, by the nature of what they are, do not have within themselves the quality of the unshakable. Only one thing does. Therefore let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And thus let us offer to God acceptable worship, with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire, a kingdom, not an experience, not a feeling, not a private spiritual reality, accessible only to certain kinds of people with certain kinds of temperament. A kingdom, something with the solidity and the structure and the permanence that the word implies, but with a foundation that is not made of anything created, because it is the kingdom of the one who made everything created. This cannot be shaken because it is not subject to the forces that shake created things. Armies cannot take it. Markets cannot collapse it. Time cannot erode it. The worst that human beings can do to each other and to the world does not touch the foundation of it. The kingdoms that have risen and ruled and fallen across human history, every empire that looked permanent from the inside, all of them were built of shakeable material. This one is not, and you have been given it. We are receiving a kingdom. The kingdom is already in motion, already real, already yours in the sense that the inheritance of a child is theirs even before the full transfer. You are receiving it, which means the receiving is underway, which means the ground beneath you right now, even in the middle of the shaking, is not ultimately the ground that can give way. The word the letter adds here is worth sitting with: reverence and awe. Not because God needs your reverence, because you need it. Because the thing that keeps human beings from building their lives on the unshakable kingdom, even when they know about it, even when they believe in it, is that the shakeable things are more immediately present to the senses. The money is in the account right now. The approval is available right now. The career advancement is visible right now. The comfort is accessible right now. And the kingdom is real, genuinely real. But it is the kind of real that requires a different kind of seeing than the kind your eyes do on their own. Reverence and awe are not emotions you perform. They are the result of actually perceiving what is in front of you. They are what happens when you have looked at the unshakable long enough and honestly enough that it starts to feel more solid under your feet than the things that can be shaken. Consider what the world has offered you as security. The career you built and could lose tomorrow. The savings account that can be emptied by a medical crisis. The reputation that can be damaged by a single public moment. The relationship that requires two people to keep choosing it. The youth and the health that the body will eventually stop providing, no matter how carefully you manage them. None of these things are worthless. None of them are nothing. They are real and they matter and they are worth caring for. But they are made of shakeable material. They were never meant to be the ground. They were meant to be held lightly, used well, offered generously, and not treated as if the permanence they do not have is the permanence you need. The world gives you security made of created things and calls it enough. This letter says, there is a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and you have been given it. And the giving was accomplished by the one who entered the holy places once for all with his own blood and secured an eternal redemption, and now sits at the right hand of the throne of God and always lives to make intercession. That is the fifth thing this letter will not let you miss. The world offers you security built from created things. Jesus gives a kingdom that remains when created things tremble. And what remains when everything shakeable has been removed is the only thing worth building your life on. The shaking is not the end of the story. It is the revealing of what was always there beneath it. But the kingdom that cannot be shaken is not only something you receive, it is something you live from. And living from it has a shape, a direction, a cost. The letter has one more thing to say about what it looks like to actually live in light of everything it has argued. And it is not what most people expect after a chapter about cosmic shaking and unshakable kingdoms. It is an image of a man dying outside the city walls, outside the place where the respectable and the recognized and the accepted gathered to do the things that respectable people do, outside the temple, outside the structures that defined who belonged and who did not. And it is a question addressed to everyone who has heard this letter and believed it. Are you willing to go there too? The system had a category for things that did not belong inside. In the wilderness, when Israel traveled, the camp was the center of organized life. The tabernacle was at the middle of it. The tribes arranged around it. The whole structure oriented toward the presence of God in the center. The camp was where you belonged, if you belonged. Where the worship happened. Where the community gathered and the rituals were performed and the life of the nation was lived. And outside the camp was where you went when you could not be inside it. The person with a skin disease. The body of an animal sacrificed for the sin of the whole community, which could not be left near the altar, but had to be taken out and burned in a clean place outside the camp. The things that carried the weight of contamination, that had absorbed what needed to be removed from the community, were taken out, away from the center, away from the gathering, away from the respectable, organized life of the people who belonged inside. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 12, Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Outside the gate, outside the camp, the place where things that could not be inside were taken. The crucifixion was not performed inside Jerusalem. It happened outside the walls, at a place of execution, which was precisely the kind of place that a city organized around respectability and order needed to keep at a distance. The dying of criminals was not something that happened in the middle of the city. It happened outside, where it would not contaminate the life going on within the walls. And the one who is, as this letter has argued across 13 chapters, greater than the angels, greater than Moses, the exact imprint of the nature of God, the high priest who entered the holy places once for all, the mediator of the new covenant, the founder and perfecter of faith, that one died in the place reserved for people and things that did not belong inside. The irony of this is not accidental. It is the logic of the whole letter, arrived at in its most specific and physical form. The one who opened the way into the presence of God died outside the place where the religious life of his people was organized. The one who is the fulfillment of everything the temple system was pointing toward was executed, where criminals were executed, outside the city, outside the camp, outside every structure that marked the boundary between belonging and not belonging. And then the letter says this: "Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured." Let us go to him outside the camp. This is not a metaphor being kept safely at the level of metaphor. It is a direction, a movement, a willingness to be in the place where he was, which is outside whatever structure defines who is inside and who is not, who belongs and who does not, who is respectable and recognized and whose presence is welcome. For many early followers of Jesus, especially those formed by Jewish scripture and worship, following him could mean being placed under real pressure from the communities and structures that had once given them belonging. The comfort of the familiar, the relief of not being the person who causes tension, the ease of not having to explain yourself or defend your commitments or absorb the friction that comes from being different from the people around you in ways that matter. Hebrews does not pretend the cost is not real. It does not offer a version of outside the camp that has been made comfortable enough that it does not really cost anything. It says, "Bear the reproach he endured." The reproach is real. The being outside is real. The not belonging to the camp that defines respectable and recognized and accepted is real. But then it gives the reason. And the reason is not guilt. It is not obligation. It is not the threat of what will happen if you stay inside. The reason is a city. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Here, this camp, this city, this structure of belonging and acceptance and social location that you have been weighing against the cost of following Jesus to where he went. It is not a lasting city, not because it is obviously failing, not because you can see with your eyes that it is temporary, but because it is built of the same material as everything else in the created order. Shakeable material, material that does not carry within itself the principle of its own permanence. You were not made for a city that cannot last. You were made for the one that can, and the one who went outside the camp, who died at the place of execution, who bore the reproach of being found in the wrong place by the people who were keeping track of who was in the right place. That one is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Outside the camp was not the end of his story. It was the road to the city that is to come. And he has already arrived, and he is already there. And the city he is in is the one that cannot be shaken. Let us go to him outside the camp. This does not look the same for everyone, and the letter does not prescribe what it looks like in the specific details of a specific life. But there is something it does prescribe, which is the orientation, the direction, the willingness to let the city that is to come weigh more in your decisions than the city that is here. Even when the city that is here is visible and immediate, and the city that is to come requires the same quality of seeing that Hebrews has been calling faith since chapter 11. Think about what camp you are weighing right now. The approval of people whose approval has come to matter to you more than it should. The identity that comes from belonging to a group that requires you to hold certain positions and avoid certain questions and present yourself in certain ways. The comfort of not having to bear the friction of being different. The social location that comes from being recognized as someone who belongs, who is inside, who does not have the awkwardness of being the person who followed something outside the walls. The letter is not telling you to be difficult for the sake of being difficult. It is not calling you to a performative outsider identity. It is asking a simpler and harder question. Is the city you are seeking the lasting one or the temporary one? And does the answer to that question show up in where you are willing to be found? Because the one who gave you the unshakable kingdom, the one who opened the way into the presence of God through his own blood, the one who endured the cross for the joy set before him, the one who always lives to make intercession, was found outside the camp, at the place of execution, outside the walls. And he was not there because he had nowhere better to be. He was there because that is where the people who needed him most were. And because the city that is to come is not built by staying safely inside the camps that human beings construct to define who belongs and who does not. It is built by people willing to go where he went, bearing what he bore, looking at the joy set before him rather than the reproach that surrounded him, trusting that outside the camp is not the end of the road, but the beginning of the one that leads somewhere that cannot be taken away. For Hoti, we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. And we seek it together, bearing one another's burdens, holding fast to the confession of our hope, considering one another to stir up love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, encouraging one another, outside the camp, toward the city, with the witnesses behind us and the founder of our faith before us, and the kingdom that cannot be shaken already ours, in a way that the world cannot see, and time cannot erode, and death cannot finally defeat. That is where he went. And the letter has spent 14 chapters building to a single, simple, costly invitation. Let us go to him there. Someone rolls the letter up. The room is quiet in the way rooms go quiet after something has been read aloud that was too large to immediately respond to. Not the quiet of having nothing to say. The quiet of needing a moment before saying anything at all. We do not know what happened next. There is no record of the conversation that followed. No account of who wept and who argued and who sat with their hands in their laps staring at the floor and who stood up and said something that changed the way everyone else in the room thought about what they had just heard. The letter arrived. It was read. And then history moves on without telling us what the people in that room decided to do with it. What we know is that the letter survived. Not because it was archived carefully in a place where important documents were kept, because it kept finding people who needed it, because every generation produced someone sitting in a room very much like that one, tired in exactly the way the letter was written for, carrying exactly the question the letter was written to answer, and hearing in it something that would not let them go. You heard the question at the beginning. What are you tempted to return to when Jesus feels unseen? The letter spent 14 chapters answering it, and the answer it gave was not the things you are tempted to return to are worthless. Many of them are not worthless. The angels are real. Moses was faithful. The priesthood served its purpose. The sacrifices meant something. The traditions that shaped you have genuine value. The guides and communities and systems that pointed you toward God were pointing at something true. But none of them are Him. And all of them, in the end, are made of material that can be shaken. The angels serve and withdraw. The guides are faithful and they die. The systems point and they cannot be what they point toward. The sacrifices repeat. And the repetition tells you the wound is still open. The cities you build are real and they do not last. And then, after all of it, after the priesthood and the covenant and the blood and the curtain and the witnesses and the race and the shaking of everything that can be shaken, after the invitation to draw near and hold fast and go outside the camp toward the city that is to come, the letter ends with a single sentence. Not a summary. Not a list of what you have learned. A sentence. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Read it slowly enough to feel the weight of it. Yesterday, today, forever. The whole span of time. And then past time into the permanent. And He occupies all of it without changing. Yesterday He was what He was. Today He is what He was. Forever He will be what He is. The angels changed their assignments. Moses completed his task and was gathered to his people. The high priests aged and died and were replaced by their sons, who aged and died and were replaced by their sons. The temple was built and it burned. The old covenant was real and it was completed, and the new covenant stands in its place. Everything in the created order that carries the principle of change and ending within it has changed and ended, or will. He has not. He will not. After everything the letter has walked you through, this sentence is not a slogan. It is the answer to the question underneath all the other questions. The question that every exhausted person asks. The one that does not always get spoken out loud because it feels too naked to say, is there anything that will not eventually leave? The letter says yes, and it gives the name, the one who is greater than the angels, and greater than Moses, and greater than the priesthood, and greater than the sacrificial system. The one who entered the holy places once for all, and secured an eternal redemption. The one who opened the new and living way through the curtain, the one who always lives to make intercession, the one who endured the cross for the joy set before Him and is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God, the one who suffered outside the camp so that you could be sanctified through His blood, the founder and perfecter of faith, the mediator of the new covenant, the exact imprint of the nature of God. Him. He is the same. Yesterday, when the letter was first read in that room, we cannot locate to people we cannot name. Today, wherever you are sitting right now, whatever you brought into this day, whatever the weight is that you have been carrying, whatever the question is that has not yet been answered, whatever the distance is between where you are and where you thought you would be by now, He is the same, and forever. Past the point where the things that can be shaken have been shaken and removed, and what remains is the kingdom that cannot be shaken. Past the point where the temporary has finally revealed itself as temporary, and the eternal has finally revealed itself as eternal. Past the end of the story, as you can currently see it. Still the same. This is not comfort that explains everything. It does not answer why some of the people in Hebrews 11 were rescued and some were sawn in two. It does not resolve the specific unanswered prayers or justify the specific costs you have paid or make the outside the camp life look easier than it is. It does not make the drift untempting or the race less long than it is. What it does is this: it gives you a fixed point. In a world where everything is moving, where everything that seemed solid has proven to have some shakeability in it, where the people and the systems and the structures you trusted have proven to be made of the same mortal and temporary material as everything else. There is one fixed point, one thing that does not change, because it is not made of the kind of thing that changes. One ground that does not give way because it is not made of created material that carries within itself the possibility of giving way. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, forever. The faith that started as fire and became furniture does not have to stay furniture. It can become fire again, not because you worked hard enough to ignite it, because the one it is faith in has not changed while you drifted. He was the same when you were drifting. He is the same right now. He will be the same when you take the next step toward him. Whether that step is small and uncertain and feels nothing like what faith is supposed to feel like, or whether it is the step you take having finally understood, in your bones rather than just your head, that the things you keep returning to cannot hold what only he can hold. The people in that room made their decisions, whatever they were, and their names are not recorded, and what they decided does not change what the letter says. The letter was not made true by their believing it. It was written because it was true, and they were invited to receive what was true. And the invitation has been open in every generation since. It is open now. The letter has said what it came to say. The question at the beginning has been answered, as fully as it can be answered in words, which is not the same as fully enough to remove the need for the faith the letter describes. The answer points at a person, not a proposition. The person is the same. The pointing is still accurate. You know the question you came in with. You know whether something in these 14 chapters found it. If it did, you know what to do with that. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, someone who is sitting in their own version of that first-century room right now, tired in a way they have not been able to name, carrying a question they have not said out loud, weighing the cost of continuing against the comfort of returning. Send this to them before you close out, not because you have the words to say what they need to hear, because someone already wrote the letter.